Hi there, my name is Stephanie and today I'm going to teach you how to make a baby size easy stair quilt. So this tutorial is designed for beginners who haven't really quilted before. It's a nice little introduction. The supplies and materials that you're going to need to go and get is 4 different colors. So that's my bright green, my sort of camo print hockey, my blue, and my multi-sport. Each of those requires 0.4 meters. I've used flannel, but you could use cotton as well. Those are nice beginner fabrics to use. And then you only need 0.2 for your bright blue kind of corners in the bottom of your quilt right there. So 0.4 for your main 4 fabrics and 0.2 meters of your bright blue corners that I've used in this example. You're also going to want to get 1.4 meters for the back of your quilt, so you could pull something totally different into it. I've pulled the camo hockey, so 1.4 meters for your back, and then you'll also want 0.3, so 0.3 meters for your binding. I used a color in my quilt again, so if you do that, you'd want to add it to one of your yardages. So if you needed 0.4 meters of the dark blue, and you're going to bind it with the same matching dark blue, you would add 0.3, so you'd need to get 0.7 meters of that one color, so you have enough for the blocks and the binding together. Now I have used a fleece. A polar fleece is my sort of batting to give it a little warmth in between. It's cheaper than your sort of normal cotton natural batting that you buy for quilts. And I just did that to be more cost effective. No one sees it in the middle. It's the same sort of weight. And so as a beginner project, that's a nice substitute to use. So if you have all those fabrics, then please see my instructions that are attached on the size of blocks and how many of each that you need to cut, and we'll get started. The first step in making your quilt is cutting all your rectangles and squares according to the pattern, which is available below this video. If you have a nap to your fabric, which is a one-way design, for instance, if you look closely at this one, there's hockey players in this pattern. You want to make sure your one-way design or pattern is with it face up with the rectangle going sideways. So you don't want to have your hockey players the wrong way, and then they will be sewn in going sideways in your quilt. So the quilt has the pieces sort of with the long way of the rectangle going across, and so therefore you want to make sure that your nap is face up according to the design. The first step in assembling your quilt is to lay your pieces on a nice big space with all of them face up in the order that you want to actually sew them in. This makes it easier for pinning and sewing all your pieces in a nice easy manner. So we're going to be sewing these row by row. So we're going to start with row 1, the top of our quilt, and this one in this specific step quilt has 3 rectangles. So when they're face up, all you want to do is get in the habit of flipping them right sides together. So you're just going to flip that one over, and we're going to pin down this seam, and we're going to sew that. And I've left 4/8 of an inch seam allowance on this quilt for beginners. Normally quilters sew with 1/4 inch and it's a bit narrower. I'm making it a bit wider so that you can catch all your seams and there won't be tiny little holes, as a 1/4 inch is sometimes a difficult seam allowance to start sewing when you're just starting out. So you're going to just sew from here to there following the 4/8. And then when you come back, this will flip just nicely like that, and then you just flip again over, so it's always right sides together. So we've sewn our first seam down here. I've put it back in place with my top row, and now all we're going to do again is flip right sides together. So I can either flip this one down so it's right sides together, and we're going to sew this seam, or if you always like to just flip from left to right, you could flip the green over and pin it along this edge. Okay, so you're always putting them back good sides up so you can see your pattern and how it's looking. And now I would sew down this line at the 4/8. So I've sewn my first row together, and it's a good idea to press each of your seams after you sew them so they lay nice and smooth. We are joining just row by row right now, but after we've done that, we will be joining our rows together, and all our intersecting seams should stay nice and smooth so that they either match or don't bubble while sewing the next pieces together. You will also notice it shrank quite a bit because of the seam allowances. So now we're going to go to row number 2, and similarly to the top row, you are just going to take your first block and flip it right side down and sew along your edge so that it'll flip back like this. So you're going to continue this now for the rest of your quilt, just working one row at a time and joining the rows together. Now that all your rows are assembled, you're going to lay them back on the floor like you did before, the way you would like the quilt to look. And now we're just going to flip them down. So same idea. You're going to take the top row here and you are going to just flip it face down so good sides are touching. And you're going to sew all the way along the long seam. So I would start on this end and I would sew all the way along. So good sides are facing each other and it would flip back up. And then you're going to come back and repeat it. Put it face up and flip down and join it along the next seam. You're going to keep doing that over and over until all the seams are joined and you have one complete quilt. I do want to point out that ideally we want our seams to be aligned in the middle of our bigger block. If you have an intersecting seam, then these seams should always be kind of aligned in the middle of your long block. It will make it look a little bit more symmetrical when you sew it together like stairs as you pin that long seam. You should now have sewn all your rows together horizontally so that you form your large quilt front. So once you've done that, now you have a finished size to the front of your quilt. So your next step is to cut sort of your batting layer and your backing to be the same size. Now normally when you are an advanced quilter, you definitely would get the natural cotton sort of batting. It's quite expensive. It's lovely. However, when we're just starting out, I recommend just using a layer of fleece in between. So I've gone and bought some from just the clearance area of my fabric store. Like I said, no one's going to see this. It's going to actually be in the middle of your quilt between the outside and the backing. So I have this lovely pink and brown stripe fleece, but that doesn't matter what it looks like. So I'm going to flip this actual quilt now wrong side up, and so that I can put my fleece on top and measure the same sort of size out. So I'm going to lay this wrong side out. Then I'm going to put my fleece on top and sort of pin the two together so I can get an accurate size to cut my sort of my batting layer out. And then I'm going to repeat this with my backing. So this is going to be my middle layer, and I'm going to lay it and pin it all the way around nice and smooth and cut it to be the same size. And then I'm going to repeat it with my backing. So my backing, I've chose just the camo sort of hockey print. So when you're all done this step, you should have 3 sort of big layers of fabric. You should have your outside quilt that you just finished sewing, your sort of fleece liner, we're going to use it as our batting, and then your backing fabric, and they should be all cut to the same size. So just to show you what I've done is I've just pinned around my entire sort of quilt to my fleece, and now I will cut my fleece away so that my fleece is the exact same size as my quilt front. So I've cut my fleece to fit my top of my quilt, and I just wanted to show you how you can add your next layers to your backing. So I haven't unpinned my fleece, and I've put my backing with bad side up. So after I'm done pinning this all together, I will have the sandwich of the quilt in the right sort of order that I want for sewing around the edges. So I'll have my outside the right way with my fleece in between, and then my outside quilt on top. So I'm going to pin around these edges and cut my backing to be the same size. You've cut all 3 layers to be the same size. Again, this video is targeted to the beginner quilter, so most of you don't have a walking foot at home. It's a sort of a specialized sewing machine foot that helps sew multiple layers together so they don't slip. It has feed dogs underneath it. So you have the option of sewing sort of down your steps through all 3 layers to quilt your quilt, but I would only do that if you have a walking foot. If not, we're just going to do the 10 line all the way around the edges of our quilt so that we're sort of sealing our 3 layers together and prepping it to add our binding as our finishing step. So this is a walking foot attachment, and as I mentioned earlier, it has sort of those white bead dogs on the top. It helps pull through multiple layers, so more than 2 layers at a time, so that the bottom feed dogs are in your sewing machine and the top feed dogs of the foot sort of pull through your fabric at the same pace, so one doesn't sort of slide and then they don't line up at the end. So if you have one, and if they came with your machine, I would put it on now. You have to unscrew your foot attachment to put it on. If you don't have a walking foot, don't worry, you'll use your regular foot. You'll just make sure you have lots of pins in your quilt to make sure that it doesn't slide, and obviously don't take your pins out until you just approach them to reduce slippage as well. So I've kind of looped it around my sewing machine, and that lever sits right above sort of this screw up there, and then I'm going to replace my actual screw, and that's how you put on your walking foot. So I'm going to sew around the outside edges of my quilt now, just so it holds the 3 layers together. I'm going to follow the 10 line on my throat plate or the edge of your presser foot, whatever you find easier to follow. And you are going to sew all the way around the circumference of this quilt. When we sew at a 10 line, when you sew your binding on, you won't see it because we will be sewing sort of in more of a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So this will be hidden. It's just so it holds all 3 layers and makes the quilt act as one. You've now sewn around the circumference of your quilt, so we're going to move on to our binding to finish the edges of our quilt. So you will cut 5 strips of your 2-inch wide fabric that you're using for your binding, and we're going to join them all together into one long sort of snake. And the way you want to do that is with diagonal seams. And so you're going to place right sides together. So this is my good side up, and I'm going to put my good side down, and I'm going to put them sort of at right angles to each other. And then I'm going to draw a chalk line that starts in the top left-hand corner of this strip and sort of ends up in the bottom right-hand corner of the one that's going horizontal. And if I sew right on this diagonal, then it will open up and be a nice, actually straight line for my binding. So you want to join all 5 of your strips right now and do the same thing. Is just join top left corner to bottom right-hand corner, give yourself a nice chalk line, and sew them all together so you form one long strip. Once you've sewn your diagonals, I sewed in contrasting threads so you could see, you're going to trim away your seam allowance, leaving about a centimeter behind in width from your stitching. So I'm going to just trim away some of that bulk, and then we're going to open this up and we're going to press this nice and flat open with our iron so that it stays as least bulky as possible when we sew this to our quilt. So you'll just do that to all your seams that you've sewn, and then it gives you a nice long strip, and the diagonal is a nice way to finish it off to join multiple pieces together. After you've trimmed your diagonal seams, it's easiest if you prep your binding with pressing it first. So I take my binding with bad side up. I'm going to press it so my good side is out, and I'm going to just press it right in half. And then I'm just going to do a little chunk here so you can see. Once you've pressed that in half, you're going to go and then crease this raw edge to the middle and this raw edge to the middle, and give that a press all the way along. And then you're just going to press it back along that first crease. It'll naturally sort of fold right along that crease again, and I would just touch it up with another little bit of a pressing, and what you get is a double folded bias strip and binding that we can use to bind the edge of our quilt. So if you prep this, it just saves a lot of work later on, and it keeps it really uniformed in width. So you're going to complete that with the whole length of this strip that you've sewn together. Once your entire binding is pressed with your sort of double fold, I should mention that you could buy bias tape at the store in packages. You want to look for the double fold extra wide bias tape, and they come in solid colors that you could purchase, and then this is all done for you. I like it out of the flannel, and that the color of the blue matches exactly with the type of fabric I'm using, so I made my own. You're going to start with about 6 inches down from the cut edge or the start of your binding, so that allows some extra to join up when we've made our way all the way around our blanket. And I'm going to start pinning and clipping it about 1/3 of the way down my long edge of my quilt. So I'm not going to ever start on a corner. I want my seam to sort of happen with some room to butt up my ends. So just approximately, and again I'm going to start to clip about 6 inches from my raw edge of my binding. So I'm going to open up my binding. I have my bad side of my blanket up, and I'm going to open up my binding like this so raw edges are even, and I use little clips. These fabric clips are very handy. You could pin it, and you are going to just keep pinning this right to the edge until you reach your corner, and then I'm going to show you how we do a mitered corner on our blanket. So essentially we're going to be sewing in that first crease that we pressed, and then your bias tape will sit nicely on the back, and then it will flip up and over to cover our seam on the good side, and then we will replace it with a top stitch, but we'll get there. So you're just going to start, like I said, about 6 inches with no sewing. We're going to start at my first clip here and keep clipping up to your corner, and then I'll show you how we miter our first corner together. So when you approach your first corner, I'm going to chalk a line so you can see how you will be sewing this, but you will be sewing along your crease, and you're going to stop. There's your top edge of your quilt. You're going to stop a 1/2 inch before you reach the end. So I'm going to kind of give myself a mark here that is about a 1/2 inch away, and then you're going to just pivot and do a diagonal into the corner. So you're essentially going to stitch along your crease. You stop about a 1/2 inch away from the top edge of your blanket, and then you're going to pivot it and sew into that corner like so. And that way it forms your mitered corner. After you've done that, and that stays, this edge will get pulled up and get pinned or clipped all the way along. So it kind of forms, I call it the TP at the corner. So this stays flat, and then you kind of turn your bias. So you could, when you flip it up, you come right back down on it. So the same raw edge is even with the top edge of your quilt, and then you would start again and sew along the crease. I'm going to go ahead and sew this in gray thread so you can see it a little bit closer up front at how this corner will look. So I'm almost at my corner where I've drawn my pivot mark. So I've left my seam flat open. I'm following the crease line that I pressed, or I actually prefer to follow the 4/8 line. It's the same measurement. It's a 1/2 inch is what we creased our bias tape in. And so I'm going to sew up until my little yellow mark, and then I'm going to leave my needle down into my fabric. I'm lifting up my foot and I'm pivoting and sewing out to my corner. So I'm just going to meet up with the corner of my quilt at this point. Kind of at the 45 is what I'm sewing, and I'm just sewing like that. To fold the mitered corner, we stopped a 1/2 inch away from our edge. We pivoted into our corner at a 45. So then you're going to take your binding and you're going to flip it up like this, and you're going to create the 45 sort of right like that, and then you're going to flip your binding straight back down so that it is even with this edge. So I'll do that one more time. You take your binding, it's sewn at that 45, so it kind of gives you a guide to fold your binding in that angle, and you just turn it up so that folding this back down, there's a little bit of a fold that joins and matches up at that side, and then your raw edges will match here, and then you're going to sew along your creased edge again, and then stopping again 1/2 inch away from your next corner and pivoting at a 45 off, just like you did on your first corner. As you approach your starting point, you want to stop about 6 inches away from your starting point so that you have enough room that we can draw your nice meeting point and join our two tails together in a nice easy seam. So I'm going to sew for probably 1 more inch, and then I'm going to just stop and not attach it the whole way, as we will chalk a line for our seam for our binding. To join your two edges where we started the binding and ended the binding, we're going to sort of pull our strip down and then fold it at a 45. So I'm sort of just bending it down. So this forms a right angle, and our fold line here is at a 45 sort of to our raw edge. And then we're going to do the same thing with this one, and we're going to fold it at a 45 so they sort of butt up, the two folds, as if it were a seam like this. And so I'm going to just finger press my little creases, and then with some chalk I'm just going to mark my creased line there to give myself my stitching line, essentially. So that one's marked there on my bad side, and so I can fold it sort of back along that crease, and then I'm going to do the same for this side. Okay, so now you can take your two ends and actually pin them along so that your yellows are overlapping, and sew right along that edge. So just to show you that pinned, I have them, they crisscross with right sides together, and then your yellow line that you marked should overlap at that same spot on both sides. Before you cut your extra tails that we have, I would just lay it against your quilt to ensure that that distance fits in nicely, which this does, before we make the final cut. Because if something shuffled on you or it didn't meet up quite as nicely. You still have some wiggle room with the extra that is there. Once you're happy, go ahead and cut that again with about 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then you're going to press that flat open. You can get rid of your triangles along the top edge here, and you're going to just complete that seam. So you're just going to, now where we left that 6-inch opening, you're going to just connect your 2 lines so that your binding is sewn all the way around your quilt. You're almost done your quilt. We've attached your binding. Now we're going to give it a press along the back side so that seam sits really nice and smooth and doesn't roll back down. Once you've pressed all the way along your back side, it's now time to pin your binding up and over your top edge. So I'm going to just roll my quilt sort of to the good side here so you can see. So I'm going to be taking my nice folded edge. So again, it's still creased at my double fold, and I'm going to just clip it up and over to the good side. So you're going to use lots of pins or clips at this part and make sure it covers that seam. If when you put this up and over your seam, your stitching shows like that, it just means your seam allowance was a little bit wide at that part. And so I would trim my seam allowance, just that little edge, a little shorter, so that your folded edge can go right over and cover the seam line. You don't want to see any stitching on the good side of your blanket. When you get to a corner, you're going to clip it on one side of your corner here, and then kind of just fold it straight on down, so you're forming your 45 down there, and you're going to fold it back up, and you're going to get this lovely mitered corner on your good side, and you'll clip it there. We are going to clip this all the way along our outer edge so that we know that our binding sits nice and smoothly, and then you're going to put it in your sewing machine with some matching thread, and you're going to sew close to that fold that's closest to your blanket, all the way along, pivoting, so leaving your needle down in your sewing machine, lifting up your foot and spinning, and continuing to stitch down all 4 sides in one go, and that would complete your blanket. So let's go ahead and do that. You are now done your first quilt. This is the step quilt for beginners. You have just sewn that little binding edge close to the inside edge of your quilt right here, so it's stitched down and all sealed all the way around. You could hand stitch this. I know many quilters slip stitch along this edge all the way along, but it can be done quicker obviously with machine, and so that's what we did for you today as your beginner step. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe to my channel for more easy to do projects.